Thank you, Jim. You didn't say what kind of a frog you regard us as, so to put it in context, let me try and cover this in 3 points. Firstly, Dow is big both in green and brown, as you've mentioned. Second, climate policy for us is very much a multi-decades resource challenge. And the third point is that real progress starts once you've developed alternatives that are cost-effective enough to drive global investments. Let me start quickly on the Dow side. The simplest way to understand us is the number 5. We are $50 billion in sales, 50,000 people, roughly, about 5,000 products. Our fossil fuel bill is something like $25 billion a year. So I would say we have 25 billion reasons to look for alternatives. But we also have a big green business. We have greenhouse gas and energy savings businesses today that are worth about $5 billion US dollars, which we want to grow to 15 billion, another 5 in 10 years' time. So we are green and brown, but one thing I can assure you is decisions are always black and white. The second point is climate as a multi-decade process. New energies, and there's a lot of history to prove this, take about 30 years to establish a 1% global share. So we're talking very, very long time frames. Our global goal, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, is to reduce greenhouse gases by 50% by 2050. Now, in pre-Kyoto, greenhouse gases were growing about 2% per annum. They then began to accelerate and are now heading even towards 4%. So we've actually had 2 decades where we've been running in the wrong directions. If you're a pessimist, if you're an optimist, you could say there's lots of learnings we could apply to the future. And we are in a future now which is much more a bottom-up, nationally driven process. But we have 4 decades to learn and reverse that process. As I mentioned earlier, and this is really my third point, is protecting the climate is going to be how do we get global investments to reverse their current trends and operate in a resource-constrained world. And that's how we've really been driving our strategy within Dow. If you look at Dow, we have a more than 100-year history, and almost from the beginning, energy saving was an important part of that. In the last 15 years, we've put out a public strategy which has been published on our website annually. It has saved ourselves about $9 billion since we started 15 years ago. The first 10-year program saved 4 after an investment of just $1 billion. So we still believe there is huge amounts that can be done in resource efficiency, but needs to be done much, much more broadly, as does investing in alternatives. Now, there is no such thing as a green investment, but there is something as a low-carbon investment. The problem with low-carbon investments is typically they are higher cost, and if they're higher cost, you then need a carbon price to make up the difference. Our other challenge is that most of these new investments are occurring in developing countries. So the way we tackle this from a corporate perspective is we insisted everywhere in the globe, no matter where they invest, that they include a carbon price, even if that doesn't exist today. We allow the regions to decide the level of that price, but we do insist on a price so that they are future-proofing their investments by looking at the options of what a higher carbon price sometime in the future could do to that. The other thing we try and do is when we look at things like renewable developments, we try and recognize up front that the big challenge is cost. So for example, when we're investing in solar, and we have very substantive plans in solar, we are going for a mass-produced PV-type tower project, which has multifunctionalities to deliver on its, not just electricity, but to deliver protection and so on. But it's done in a mass-produced basis so that costs can go down. The same is true when we look at things like offshore wind. This is really an area which is not so dissimilar, curiously enough, from building materials for offshore oil platforms. You have corrosion, you have all kinds of other heavy engineering challenges, and that's where we focus our attention to try and drive those costs down. But all the numbers show you that ultimately this only matters if you can do it globally. If you consider the endless debates we have in Europe about whether we should move from a 20 to 30% reduction target, you have to realize that difference is about 1 week of China's emissions. If you look at the past 2 decades of performance, even in relatively good performing areas like Europe, you have to realize that our reductions are actually exceeded by imported carbon in the products we import. So I would say overall, to be a leader, for the EU to be a leader, we think the most important thing is to drive the cost down, because if you can make progress in producing these alternatives in a truly competitive fashion, get the cost down enough, then they will be applied globally. So in summary, I would say our key message is get the costs of these alternatives sufficiently low that they will be taken up globally, and that will be the secret to turning green promises into black and white progress. Thank you.